All right, everybody. I am here with Peyton Smith from over at Fourth Radical, and we are continuing our discussion of The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, and we are today discussing chapters 7, 8, and 9. So that's clothing, ways and means, and luxury, the need for luxury. So we're gonna look over those. Peyton, do you have any ideas to start us off?
So to kick it off with this one, hold on, let me get back to clothing. So he kicks it off with this section. Obviously, chapter 7 is talking about the issue of clothing. One of the interesting things is that he seems to think of clothing specifically as a need. And I think that that's one of the interesting debates, which I think you can have about clothing. So he doesn't want to do the kind of expropriation which was he sort of criticized previously, which is that what we do is we take possession of all the overcoats specifically, you put them in a pile and then there's a dogfight for who gets what coat. He's saying, no, that's the foolish way to think about it. In fact, let's just leave, if you have 10 coats, fine, keep your 10 coats, because most people are going to want a new coat anyway. Right. They don't want a coat that's been grace the shoulders of a fat bourgeois. He says, great quote there. He says, no, what we mean by expropriation for clothing is we need to be taking the resources, taking the supplies and the means of production in order to then go out and produce our own clothing and produce our own things. And so he says here, quote, the only possible solution will be to take possession in the name of the people, all the shops and warehouses where clothing is sold and stored, and to throw out open the doors so that each can take what they need. So you go into the stores and you get basically what you need in terms of clothing. I imagine that a lot of people would object to that, saying that, people are just going to take more than they need. They're going to take silk and linen and all these beautiful types of clothing that we can't all own a velvet gown. And he anticipates this objection, and he goes on to say, in at least what's the next page for me, he says, sort of quoting the adversaries who would be saying this, but everyone will want a sable-lined coat or a velvet gown, exclaim our adversaries. He says, frankly, we do not believe it. Every woman does not dote on velvet, and nor does every man dream of sable linings. Even now, if we were to ask each woman to choose her gown, we would find that some prefer simple, practical garments, and some others would find fantastical trimmings and the fashionable worldly effects. I think I read that sentence wrong, but I mean, you get the point there that the idea, of course, is that some people are going to want practical things and some people are going to want more fashionable things. It's not going to be the case that everybody wants these super fashionable garments. And he even goes on to argue that the fashion, he says here, quote, I'll just read the quote. He says, quote, taste change with the times, and the fashion which will be in vogue at the time of the revolution will certainly make for simplicity. Chris, what do you think about this? I mean, a lot of people would criticize this, saying that this is overly idealist, that he thinks that clothing could just be, you throw open the doors and everybody's going to just only take what they need. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, because I find myself when I'm reading this book, it's sort of like an exercise I have to go through where I'm not necessarily, you can't think of it in terms of today in our capitalist United States society, like what would it look like? Because things would be very different, right? Because right now, people would be lining up. They want a Supreme or, whatever brand of clothing they want. But I think that in this kind of situation, you would just inherently have less of that. I think, right now with this capitalist society, we seem to be in this cycle of I have to work a lot so I can buy something that's going to make me happy. So then I have to work a lot more to buy something that's going to make me happy. But if we got into a situation, and we'll talk about work here in a little bit, but if you knew that having a little bit of a toned down coat also meant you had to work significantly less throughout your day, I think society would kind of adjust to that, and we would kind of accept this fact that, well, yeah, if I only have to work 4 hours or 5 hours a day for 5 days a week, and it means my coat is slightly less boring, I'm okay with that, right? I can kind of get on board with that. And I think in this kind of a situation, you would have, because there will be some people who hoard and greed, are greedy about it, but there's really not as much of a motivation to hoard things and to be sort of ultra greedy about it,
Right.
because I
Well,
think
that's
there'd be some pushback in society where that would not be seen as we wouldn't put those people on a pedestal anymore. We would start to go, you're not really getting along with society. So,
Well, Chris, the linchpin of his argument, remember, it goes back to his argument about the wage system. So he argues that if there is no more poor people, there will be no more reason to accumulate because
right,
you won't be able to exploit in order to make more and more money, right? That we talked about that last time around. That's one of his linchpin arguments about the nature of the wage system. So he seems to think that if you got rid of poverty, you would also get rid of greed in a certain way. It's not quite that straightforward. He's not that straightforward of a thinker. He does have
right.
a lot of nuances where it regards that. But if you wanted to boil it down very simply, that is seems to be how he thinks about the wage system. And for the case of clothing, he's relying on what he refers to as quote the spirit of the revolution in order to carry us through the beginning time, which he says is going to be the most difficult here. In fact, he says here, he goes through a sort of a long kind of paragraph talking about how self-devotion will spring up and noble deeds will beget their like, and egotists will be ashamed of hanging back and will be drawn in spite of themselves to admire, if not to imitate the generous and the brave, referring to how people are going to act during a revolution. But then he does go on to qualify that by saying here, quote, "We do not wish to exaggerate the part played by such noble passions, nor is it upon them that we should found our ideal society," which is important. He's saying, you can't rely on this forever because this is only a temporary thing which is going to occur during a revolution when you have this sort of common spirit towards a common goal. But he basically says here at the end of that same paragraph, he says here, quote, "But we may expect their aid in the first, and that is all that we need." So I think what's really interesting here is that he specifically thinks of clothing really only as a need
Mm-hmm.
specifically. And I think that that's where you might be able to make some criticism. Is it the case that even when people are very poor or when people don't have a ton of money to spend on clothes, that they don't still try to go out of their way to look stylish in a certain kind of way? So I think that for a reasonable comparison between how people might act in a revolution, we can think more recently during kind of wartime rations and how that affected clothing and trends in fashion. So in the case of World War II, for example, it is the case that people really pulled back in terms of the kinds of clothes that they were wearing, right? I mean, so skirts, for instance, or dresses went up, and really that's where skirts kind of became more common and things like that because, it seems like an excess. If you could just cut back a few inches on your dress, then, you can save some resources for the war, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of how some of those trends came about. But it didn't mean that people became less fashionable. They just found other ways to express that fashion. And I was thinking, Chris, while reading this, about the pop up of kind of fast fashion over the past couple
Yeah.
decades, right? Where you have a lot of really cheap clothes that are clearly cheaply made. I think that, in high school, we probably all maybe experimented a little bit with kind of fast fashion when we didn't have a lot of money, but we had some money and we wanted to look fashionable and cool and stuff like that. Um, and one of the things that's interesting about fast fashion is that it is kind of fashionable. It's cheaply made. It's fast, right? But the thing about it is there aren't a ton of them, and it's still kind of expensive, right? Like if you compare it quality for quality, it's definitely a ripoff, right?
Right.
Um, but the thing about it is there aren't a ton of them in circulation. So part of the reason why it's fashionable is specifically because of the fact that not everybody's wearing it. And so fashion has an ability to express our own individuality, and our individuality can't be expressed if everybody's wearing the same thing. Now, he goes right on in chapter 9 specifically. He talks about luxury, but he doesn't include clothing in his aspects of luxury. I mean, I understand the importance of bare necessity and coats to keep everybody well clothed, but I guess my question for him and what I'm maybe worried a little bit about is how do we actually go about ensuring that everybody has clothes? Not only that everybody has clothes, but everybody has clothes which can express themselves,
Right.
which can feel like this is how I feel comfortable dressing. Dressing this way makes me feel comfortable. And so, if you have different kinds of clothing, if you have sufficient amounts, I should say, if you have sufficient amounts of clothing in order to make everybody happy, that means that you have to, that requires a lot more work, right? Like it requires people to, have designers, right? And things like that. Maybe that wouldn't be in vogue during the revolution, right? He seems to suggest that it wouldn't be. Um, but I don't know. I think that's an interesting question to ask, maybe.
And
I don't
I
know. What do you think?
Yeah, and I thought about that while I was reading this, and it's not completely clear to see exactly the point that he's trying to make, but I think he is suggesting that there still will be a diversity of clothing, right? Because he closes the
Mhm.
chapter by saying, but it may be urged, this means gray uniformity at the end of everything beautiful in life and art. Certainly not, we reply. So he seems to at least be, although he does not go
Right.
into great detail of it, he is pushing back at the end of that chapter, and he's saying, this is not just where we're all going to be wearing the same exact gray coveralls or, whatever that the uniform is. There will be a
Hmm.
diversity of things because there'll be,
And
and I think this maybe gets fleshed out in the next two chapters, although not specifically called out. Well, you'll have people making different types of things, either as part of their job to sort of earn their society, or it could call into that luxury time of the 4 hours a day that you have to express your art,
right,
could be done with clothing. So maybe that's one
right,
of
to
your
help
arts
make
is
clothing
you have
for
a
things
sewing
like that.
machine and you kind of do your own thing a little bit. And uh,
Hmm.
yeah, but so clothing is a weird thing because on one sense there is an absolute necessity to it. You have to stay warm and safe and all that kind of stuff. But then there is this artistic side to it that he brings up later. And you're right, he doesn't. I don't remember if he specifically. I think he doesn't specifically call out clothing as a type of art there.
Yeah, he seems to think of clothing specifically as a need, which, makes sense. And I do also want to point out here, like during this time, of course, it was capitalism that was oftentimes associated with kind of gray uniformity, right? Like it was, you're a little kid, an 8-year old going into the coal mine, and everybody's dressed exactly the same way. And, you look at pictures of the time, and different classes were associated with wearing certain kinds of hats and things like that. Now, part of that is just sociological, right? But part of that really was that you got a certain hat for your job, and everybody, they just gave everybody the same hat for sort of your work uniform, right? You go into a store, everybody has the same uniform, but at the time they had massive industries for whole cities, and so a whole city would look basically the
Right.
same. Maybe you'd even walk around wearing your work clothes around the shop around the day, because that was you didn't own a whole bunch else. Maybe you had your Sunday clothes and that's it. And so it is a little bit of a different time, I think, than today. And I think that, that to have a dedicated chapter to clothing, I think that a revolutionary writing an anarchist book today might not have a specific chapter dedicated to the allocation of clothing. I think that it would be buried within other parts. Not that they wouldn't speak about clothing allocation, because that's still important, obviously. But I think that the times have maybe changed a little bit
Hmm.
from when Kropotkin was writing. That's my sense. Do you think I'm wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be, it definitely could be a sense. I mean, I'm not an expert on what clothing was the sort of clothing procedures of his time, but I would think clothing
Right. I
definitely
mean,
seems to be, for a lot of people, it's a very big statement for themselves and what they're saying when they go out in public and they're wearing a certain brand or a certain style. Yeah.
yeah. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Chris, did you have any other specific things to call out with this chapter here with clothing?
Not much. That
Or
chapter is only about 2 pages, so it's a pretty
yeah, it
short
was a
one
pretty
there.
short. It was definitely a much shorter chapter than some of the other ones that were out there. So let's move on to, I guess, chapter 8 then. Or unless yeah, let's go into, I guess, chapter 8. There might be some things to sort of call back to, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you want to kick off chapter 8? Anything that you had thought
Yeah,
of?
I found it a very interesting chapter. So one of the things he does in this chapter is he basically makes an estimation at the level of work that someone would have to do in such a society. And the bottom line is that it comes down to people would work approximately half of what is considered a full-time work week now. If everyone worked half that time to supply the needs of the
Mhm.
community, that would leave us, essentially you could work the first half of the day, and that would free up the second half of the day for you to, and not to jump too far, or I'm forgetting what chapter stuff is in, but he talks about the arts and expressing yourself, and then I think that's this chapter, and you would have time to then express yourself in other ways that, what we now kind of call hobbies. But sometimes it's called out that, or he calls out here in the book that, how are you supposed to really express your art If you've just worked 10 hours straight at some laborious job, you're exhausted, and now you're going to come home and now you're going to create your art. Most people are too worn out from that. So he really shows the benefits to people being able to work enough to really supply all the needs that person needs, their physical needs, and then have time to create, which is also very beneficial to society. He calls out pretty hard that art and creativity are not to be abandoned. This is not something where we're letting all that go. He's saying, no, we need time for all those kinds of things to happen. There was I just lost the quote I was going to say, but yeah, so that's kind of where he's going in this chapter, and I found it very interesting, and it seems like we have made even more advances in a lot of things in the time since Kropotkin wrote this. It's possible that we've seen even more efficiencies, right? You can go back to like the 30s or 50s maybe, where they have those videos about the future, and they say, oh, production will be so efficient and we'll make so many jumps in production that people will only have to work a few days a week. Except what we actually did was we just gave all that increased resources up to the top, and the people didn't see any. The people are still working as hard, or maybe harder than they were, 60, 70 years ago. So we've kind of wasted this free time that Kropotkin was proposing we would have, and 60 years ago people were saying we have. We haven't realized that, but maybe that's our fault in the capitalist system, where we just let all that benefit go to the top rather than claiming it for ourselves and saying, no, we want people to only work 4 days a week or 3 days a week or something like that.
Right, and shortening our workday. I'd say this chapter, one of the interesting things is I think that he's really trying to continue that idea, which we saw in our last video when we talked about the biological integration of functions, which is the idea that, in a biological organism on the path of evolution, where, you have two separate functions, and then the functions start to work together towards a common goal, right? I think that that's kind of the general metaphor which he's tracing out through chapter 8, because he's going back again to this idea where you're going to have sort of intellectual labor being mixed in with kind of mechanical and hand-working labor, and it's one of the criticisms actually that he makes on Marx in this chapter, which maybe we'll get to. But he seems to think, for instance, that it's really important to make sure that in order to make sure that work isn't like, for instance, exhausting, is to make sure that people can have access to kind of intellectual labor in combination with material or mechanical labor. One example which he uses in the next chapter is that of a printer, right? So if you're writing a book and you're thinking about literature and all those high noble thoughts, well, you should also be involved in the mechanical operation of that, and that, making all of these projects, these literary projects, a collective effort is going to actually improve the art. Now, I don't want to get too much into that because that sort of bleeds into the next chapter, but I find that idea really interesting. How, okay, so we've advanced to a certain point and now we have the division of labor, and he's making an analogy there to like the development of different functions in a biological organism. Well, he's tracing again the path of society in evolution, as we've talked, over and over again, how Kropotkin is obsessed with Darwin. He's tracing again this idea that Darwinians kind of had at the time, which is that evolution next means that the functions are going to come together and integrate. And so he's tracing that idea through for the future of society. And he's saying that basically intellectual labor should become mixed in with capital labor. Now, to kick off sort of the beginning of the chapter, though, he talks about how we need to do more than merely take possession of land, machinery, factories, and the means of transport, etc. Capital in the hands of private owners must be appropriated and returned to the community. The important word there is, of course, returned, because he thinks that necessarily, or at least originally, did belong to the community, but that it got taken by the capitalists. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that he seems to think that like capital in and of itself, and I would agree with this, capital in and of itself cannot be asked to do any kind of charity or work towards society, right? So he says, for instance, in one of this chapter, I think maybe what is this, paragraph 4, I think, maybe this is the end of paragraph 3. He says here, for example, to expect that he, referring to the capitalist, should use his superior yield of labor in the interest of society as a whole would be to ask of him philanthropy and
Right.
charity of him. And a capitalist enterprise cannot be based on charity. Now, of course, this is being used ironically because of the way that he sort of cues it up at the beginning there, referring to the word returned. And also, he used the word charity, I think. Yeah, he used the word sees and charity earlier in the book, but in that chapter there, I think that he's basically using that ironically to say, well, it's not charity because it does originally belong to the capitalist, right? Or it does originally belong to the community, I should say. And so the capitalist then claiming it, and oh, well, this is just charity for me to try to return stuff to society.
Right.
He's saying, no, it's not charity at all. This is what naturally happens. You stole it from the community. And so he's, I think, making kind of an interesting point there, and I would definitely agree with that particular point there. What do you think,
Yeah,
Chris?
and he calls out capitalism in a number of ways in this book, and I'm not like a huge fan of capitalism going into the book, but he definitely has called out some things in this book that really reframe capitalism in a way that I guess the way I would say it is it sort of helps me escape the indoctrination that I've undergone growing up in the United States under this capitalist system, where you're kind of raised, at least when I was born, you're raised to think this idea that you want to be industrious. You're supposed to be giving all of your time contributing to some workplace, and that's where you find
Mm-hmm.
value in things. And I like that Kropotkin is kind of pointing this out and saying, no, you don't have to just be giving that away to someone else. It's okay to claim your time. That's kind of a theme throughout this chapter. That time is time that you can be using to improve your life, to become a fuller person with completing your thoughts that you are either too tired or busy to at the end of the day. So yeah, this idea of asking a capitalist, that to be charitable is inherently not what a capitalist is. That's how you become so rich, is by not just giving away and helping
By the
things.
perversion of virtues as well.
Yeah,
I think that the idea being, of course, that I mean this is well, the paradox of thrift, I suppose, is a more technical economic example. But think, for instance, of the example of saving, right? So saving is generally considered a virtue. Saving, thrift, modesty, like these things are generally considered to be virtues in at least Christian kind of Western society. But if we were to start saving, if all of a sudden all of us were to save maybe say 10% of our money, that would all be good, right?
yeah,
All be well and good. Well, it turns out that it would actually collapse the economy. It would crash the economy, and it would end up creating a situation where it would have been worse overall for everybody had they not saved. So it's a sort of perversion of virtues where it encourages us to be vicious
hmm
and discourages us to be to enjoy our virtues. And so this deep perversion of virtues, I think Kropotkin seems to think is kind of a problem here, because again, he's saying that, well, you call it charity, but really it's
right,
not charity. Really, that's what you should be doing from the get-go. And you're right there to point in on the possibility of well-being and how, if we were to distribute work more fairly, then we would all have a little bit more free time, because he specifically refers there in the second paragraph of chapter 8, he specifically refers to how the capitalist has used his wealth in order to enable himself to live without working. He says
right,
here, quote, um, the great harm done by the bourgeois society, as we have already mentioned, is not only that the capitalists have seized large share of profits of each industrial and commercial enterprise, thus enabling himself to live without working, but that all production has been taken in the wrong
right.
direction. In the wrong direction. So these individual corporations are only seeing their own self-interest, and they're not thinking about society as a whole. They're
Exactly.
not thinking about aggregated interests and what society would be interested in. In fact, if they were to do that, it would crash the
hmm
economy. If they were to even try to, if everybody were to try to, maybe a few can do it, but if everybody were to come together and try, well, then it would actually end up being worse for everybody and we'd get screwed over. Does that make sense? Well, I think Kropotkin would say no, and I think a lot of people would agree.
Yeah, and I like that point. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a good point in the book, where essentially he's not just saying, or the way I interpreted this, it's not just that capitalism and what Kropotkin is proposing, it's not just that they're different ways of handling the same thing. They fundamentally have different views of what the goal is, right? Capitalism does not see as a goal what's best for people, right? It sees what's best for the capitalists, as opposed to, if we were in a society like Kropotkin is proposing, then what automatically will happen is the needs of the people being met, because people aren't going to spend all this time investing their time and energy into a thing that isn't benefiting the society, right? In some way or another. And I don't mean necessarily the needs, but you're either fitting those sort of first level needs of food, shelter, clothing, stuff like that. And then also the peripheral needs of creativity and art and things like that. But it will be a need. It won't necessarily be a need of someone who is just trying to consume. There's a sentence in this paragraph that really sort of struck me as profound, that I think is sort of him proposing the alternative to what we've been talking about. He says, "It is a case of producing the greatest amount of goods necessary to the well-being for all with the least possible waste of human energy." And I really liked that sentence because it wasn't about money. Like, he's not saying, oh, we have to not waste money. It was about really tuning in on one of these things that we should be valuing more, that I think sometimes gets undervalued in our capitalist system, which is human energy, right? How many employees have spent their human energy working at Amazon so that Bezos could be a 200 billionaire? Right. And it was, in my opinion, a lot of that work was wasted, because who's benefiting from all that work that they did? I mean, me, when I buy something from Amazon, I guess I'm benefiting from that. But to me, that 200 billion sort of represents what he's talking about here. It's a waste of human energy, because it's just dollars that are sitting in one man's bank account, rather than helping all those people who did the actual work of getting that package to my doorstep. So I kind of liked the way he phrased that.
Right, like really reframing it as a societal issue, as a community issue, that like we're wasting resources, it's just irrational to be organized this way. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I really do appreciate that. I think you're right to really hone in on that specifically, because reframing it as a question of how society should allocate resources is, I think, like really important, because a lot of people don't think about it that way. They think about, there's the economy, there's the government, and then there's balancing the checkbook and things like that. But really thinking about, well, how are we allocating our resources? How are we allocating our production in an economy? That's a really smart way, I think, to think about it. And it really does help, I think would help a lot of people. Even just that metaphor, that idea could really help a lot of people think through really complex problems here. Now, some of the things that I think is kind of interesting here, he talks about how he says here, quote, "Economists, as is their wont, will not fail to remind us of the comparative well-being of a certain category of young, robust workmen skilled in a certain special branches of industry which have been obtained under this present system." And so sort of like, like certain people under the capitalist system, Kropotkin is saying, obtained a lot of wealth and have been successful in their workmen, right? Kropotkin is saying. Now, the thing, though, is he goes on to criticize that and say that actually their wealth is very unstable. And certainly, like during this COVID time, I think that's I think we can all maybe relate to that, or a lot of people can really relate to that. He says here, quote, "How many important industries, whether it's textiles, iron, sugar, etc., without mentioning all the sorts of short-lived industries, have not seen decline or come to a standstill on account of some speculation of the capitalist, or in consequence of natural displacement of work, or from the effects of competition among the capitalists themselves?" And so, of course, they're saying that, well, sure, there may be some people who have accumulated more wealth and more comfort as a result of capitalism, but it's ultimately unstable. And that's certainly right. Now, I mean, there is question to be had, because it does seem as though like there have been a lot more people have a lot more wealth now, as opposed to back in the time of Kropotkin, right? So I think that, reading this now, we have a little bit more information than Kropotkin did. But of course, I think that Kropotkin would be right, because this is what he would say. He would attribute it, of course, to the development of science and the development of technologies and the development of industries. Now, I mean, I suppose you can debate that, but in many respects, the economic system, isn't it, as we were just discussing there and as you were just pointing out, a question of how we allocate the resources which we do produce. So I think that I think Kropotkin would have something to say, even looking at the data today.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see sort of yeah, how we would approach that. It would be interesting to see if he was here, what he would have thought. I mean, we have made massive gains in our ability to. I mean, he would probably be amazed at what you can grow on an acre of land now compared to what was that,
Right.
160 years ago or something. I mean, we've made
Yeah,
such huge
100, yeah,
gains.
130 years
Yeah,
ago.
130 years ago. So I mean, right now he talked about a couple people being able to plow like 4 acres a day or something like that. And now he got one person. In fact, a lot of these tractors, you don't even need a person in them anymore. They just drive themselves around. You GPS it drives itself around the field, and you just have to be there a few times to kind of change things out. So you can literally have one person just taking care of
Handling acres
acres.
and acres of land. Yeah. Yeah, so I do oftentimes, like, reading through this book, I'll wonder, like, I wonder what Kropotkin would say now. I
Hmm.
wonder what he would say now. And I think the interesting thing is he's really more interested in the development of our well-being.
Right.
And there's a real question there. I think that, yes, right, he wants people to have more free time, right, more labor time. But at the end of the day, he's really interested in the development of individual well-being and individual freedom. And now, freedom not defined in the capitalist sense, right?
Right.
But freedom defined in, Kropotkin's sense of sort of well-being and the ability to develop your potentials. So I am oftentimes so curious, like, man, if you were to just, be raised from the dead and
Right.
and get to walk around the streets, like, what would he think? What would he think? It's kind of interesting. Uh, but yeah, so you want to take a look at some of his criticisms of Marx? That could be kind of interesting. Or do you
Sure.
do you have
Where
something else before
where
then?
were you looking at the
At least for me, it's the next page after those other. I'll read the quote. Um, so he says here, quote, this is the start of it's a few paragraphs before part two. He says here, the evil of the present system is therefore not that of surplus value of production that goes to the capitalist, as Rodbertus and Marx said, thus narrowing the socialist conception in their general view of the capitalist system. The surplus value itself is a consequence of deeper causes. The evil lies in the possibility of surplus value itself existing, instead of a simple surplus not being consumed by each generation. For that a surplus value should exist means that men, women, and children are compelled by hunger to sell their labor for a small part of what their labor produces, and still more so of what their labor is capable of producing. So again, there's a few ideas that we've already seen touched on earlier in the book kind of coming together in that quote there. The first major idea is, of course, what we saw, I guess, in our last video when we were chatting about how he felt like any kind of state socialist system would still maintain a wage system because it would require, essentially, because it's basically the state directing production, and it would require a wage system, which he argued would require that there still be poor. And so we're seeing that idea really come back together, along with his criticism of complex versus simple labor that we saw. I think that was maybe one or two videos ago? I'm not quite sure. Um, but also, I think that it's really interesting there. I mean, Chris, I guess I just want to ask you, like, what do you think about this? Like, do you think that this is right? Do you think that the problem is surplus value existing in and of itself? Or is it just that the resources are going to the capitalist?
uh Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly the resources going to the capitalist are an issue. I mean, just the idea of what is money, right? It seems like such a simple answer. You could just go out on the street and you ask someone, what is money? They'll give you some kind of answer, but it's way more complicated than that, right? I remember, in government class in high school, we watched some cheesy cartoon video where it was kind of explaining the point of, say, currency. And it was, in this little cartoon, they had a guy was working on a roof as a roofer, and then they had someone whose job was, something that's completed much quicker. And they were saying, well, these people need a way of exchanging their goods and services. Someone who's going to build a roof, that takes a lot of resources and time, whereas someone making some basic shoes, you can't really trade, okay, you redo my roof, I'll make you a pair of shoes, right? So, it kind of explained you need money as some way of these people can exchange value
Mm-hmm.
to each other. But then, it's not quite that simple because first of all, you get away, you get into like fiat currencies and what exactly is money. And then, so at that point we start thinking, okay, money's okay. It's just a way that we exchange goods so that the effort that we all put forward, we can use to exchange for the things we need in some kind of reasonable way. And that sounds okay until you realize the money itself becomes the end goal, right? So where it's presented as being a way that we exchange sort of our work for goods and values, in a capitalist system, the money is the goal, right? Like, Bezos didn't really say, I want to be the greatest bookstore seller that ever lived. Amazon was kind of originally for books and then it expanded. It's not like he wanted to be the greatest book seller ever. He wanted to be the richest person, right? So it really became about getting the billions and not really about the service that's being provided. So it could just be that I guess I'm undecided. It could be that the perversion lies in the fact that maybe there's a problem inherent in the money exchange itself, the exchanging of money that allows someone to get in there and say, I'm going to siphon off a little bit of all of this money and I'm going to accrue a massive amount of it. So it sort of perverts this thing that could be a good way of exchanging goods and services, but it just naturally degrades into this system which hurts people at large. I mean, is that necessarily always going to happen? I suggest yes, like that probably that's where the where the problem is, but also just surplus value existing could be a problem. I mean, if it's surplus and it's really not, obviously sometimes surpluses can be good for something, but you don't want to overdo it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, he's saying that the surplus would, if it went to the workers, then we could end this poverty, right? We wouldn't have people suffering anymore. And so the idea is, well, we should redistribute that to the workers as opposed to giving it to someone else. And he goes on in that paragraph to say here, quote, but this evil, referring to surplus value and poverty, will last as long as the instruments of production belong to the few. And so he's again criticizing Marx, saying that essentially like state approaches to capitalism are just going to are just going to sort of recreate the wage system, essentially recreate capitalism, he seems to think, because still only a few people are going to be controlling the instruments of production. The workers won't truly have seized them because the state's going to have it, because some bureaucratic body is going to have it. And that extra money, they're still going to end up being, paid a wage. That extra money then isn't going to the workers to end poverty. It might go to other programs, but it's not going directly into the hands of the workers.
Right. And you kind of have to.
I will say,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and money is an interesting point because I'm not quite sure. I don't remember for sure, but didn't Kropotkin say something about like getting rid of money and that workers are just going to exchange their goods directly? In our last section, the last time we read, I wasn't 100% sure on that. We didn't end up bringing it up in our last conversation, but that was one point where I was like, that definitely seems like something which could be very difficult to enact effectively.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of and I forget the details when we looked at the quotes, but I think that's one of the things that pops up is essentially there wouldn't be currency. You wouldn't have money because, again, it's one of these things that leads into to corruption. It seems like that's his kind of ongoing thing is wherever you find there's something that leads to corruption, you just eliminate that thing completely. You don't try to negotiate with it or control it. You eliminate it, which I think goes back to the question you were just talking about because, like I've heard historians argue that, the difference between, say, England and the U.S. is that England has always been really suspicious of like companies, whereas the U.S. has always been very suspicious of its own government. So we both kind of, like in the U.S., we always are, people are very skeptical of the government overreaching, and in England, it's a little more the other way. They're careful of companies overreaching. When really it's probably both. It's like you have, look at the modern day in our country. Well, really the country has the government has sort of overreached in a lot of ways, but so have the corporations, and then they sort of corrupt each other, right? So I can kind of get the argument that, sure, the capitalists are bad and that system's bad, but then also if you have a government in play, that is leaving that weakness for someone in that position or a group of people in that position to sort of corrupt from the government side. So I get his point.
I mean, Yeah, I mean that's what he seems to say. Now, the interesting thing though is I think Marx would respond to him by saying, well, if the people are controlling the government through some kind of democratic system, or it certainly later communists would say something like this, and it was like a truly democratically elected system, well, then what's the difference? They would say, I mean, you
Right.
know, I don't know, right? Because I don't have those texts right in front of me, but he's criticizing Marx along those lines, and it seems like, well, there's a pretty readily available response that that communists would have. You know, the sort of state communists that he, or the bourgeois communists that he calls them,
Right.
you know, that would it would be able to respond to Kropotkin, I
And I
think.
think under that
Um,
theory, like the United States should be like that. Like theoretically, we should have been able to stave off a lot of the things that are happening in this country because we, the people, would make sure that didn't happen with our votes. And yet, it seems like the
mhm.
companies, even though we regulate banks, there's a big motivation for those banks to always find some workaround, find some new way to cheat the system so they can
Yeah.
make money. And the political parties are always trying to find some new workaround. How can we corrupt the system a little bit more so that we in government we can sort of take things over a little bit? Seems like there's corrupting
Yeah, I
forces
mean
in
it's
both. Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's definitely very difficult to try to figure out how to how to develop a
Right.
government. I mean, definitely not an easy thing. So moving on through a little bit further, there's this an interesting quote here that is in at least italics. What how do you say it? Italics? I don't
Yeah.
actually know. Italics, at least in my book, it says here, it is a case of producing the greatest amount of goods necessary to the well-being of all with the least possible waste of human energy. Actually, I think that's the
Yep.
quote that you were taking a look at earlier there. Again, I mean, I think that that's such just a great quote talking about how we need to refocus about questions of how society should be arranged and not try to focus on the direct allocations or the direct individuality of a particular
Right.
capitalist, right? Like the things that they're particularly interested in, this capitalist or that capitalist, because again, it's just called charity when they try to do things for the common good, but they're the ones who control society's production. And so Kropotkin clearly seems to have a problem with this. Now, the rest of the chapter, I will say, is I don't want to say like dated, but it's not exactly like you can sort of take the general gist of it because the rest of the chapter, sort of starting here with part two through the end of chapter eight here, is basically talking about using different
Mm-hmm.
calculations for how long people would have to work. And, you know, obviously, like all of that has changed,
Right.
right? Like, you know, using calculations of how much you know, how many yards of cotton and stuff has been produced. Like, you know, read it through once, get the gist of what he's saying, but the production is obviously very different
Right.
now 130 years later than what it was then, and also the needs have changed, which I think is really important because he closes off the chapter, and this is something that I was kind of getting worried that Kropotkin wasn't going to sort of point to, but here it is right here. He says here, quote, this is the very end of chapter 8 here. He says, quote, individual needs which do not come under the categories of necessities but will probably do so later on when man's productive capacities have been augmented and those objects will no longer appear as luxurious or accessible. And so he is aware of the possibility that over time, as production increases, certain things which at one point were thought of as luxuries are going to be treated as necessities into the future. And certainly we've seen that, right? And that's, I think, one major concern that I had in the last section that Kropotkin wasn't even really aware of this because he seemed to be treating poverty as like this base unit. Like once you get past, you know, once you give people this certain amount of bread, these certain amounts of necessities, then all of a sudden people will no longer accept wage slavery
Right.
or what he calls wage slavery. And it seemed like well, I'm not sure that that really bore out, but he does seem to be aware of this kind of conversion between necessities and luxuries and how luxuries can eventually become necessities and things like that. But we'll have to see how he develops that. I'm curious how he's going to develop that moving forward, I guess. Because again, I think that that's the linchpin for his argument about the wage system. Because again, like his argument is basically, as I'm understanding it, that once your wages reach a certain amount or once people have a certain amount of need, then they won't accept the wage system because the wage system essentially means that your surplus value is getting siphoned off. And
Right.
so, you know, again, if your basic needs are met, then you won't accept wages at all. And so, um, it seemed like that was a really challenging remark. So he's at least aware of the problem. We'll have to see how he addresses the problem moving forward. Um,
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
do you have anything to add to
it's
that?
interesting how he calls that out, and as far as the wages, it it's nice the way that it's framed, because I know, like, in our society, everything is essentially traced back, like the value of a thing is based on the dollars that that thing can achieve. That's how, for most things, that's how we value them in society. So it's nice to have him call those out and talk about things like human energy, because I think that is sort of corrupting to our way of thinking, right? When we think about value a lot, at least for myself, a lot of times my brain automatically goes to some dollar amount. How can I connect this to money?
Mm.
That's the way that I can measure the value of things. Whereas, like when he talked about earlier, the well-being, that quote we keep coming back to, the well-being and the waste of human energy, that is perhaps a better way to measure things. I mean, isn't that the ultimate goal, right? I mean, is your goal in life to have the most money, or is your goal to live a happy life and do the things that will fulfill you as a human being? Well, that can't be traced back to a dollar amount, but a lot of times our brains don't reach that connection because we're so used to connecting things to some dollar value. So I think that's
Mm.
another way that the whole wage system is a sort of, it's a roadblock in our brains to try to make these connections to, well, what is the actual reward that I'm after? Am I after dying with a bunch of money, or am I after dying after I've lived a full life and a healthy life and had my well-being and those kinds of
Yeah,
things?
and he has another interesting quote about the allocation of human energy, sort of the allocation of human resources and energy here. I guess this is the second to last quote, or second to last paragraph, kind of midway through that paragraph. He says here, quote, "And if instead of every 10 men, 20 were occupied in producing useful commodities, and if society took the trouble to economize human energy, then those 20 people would only have to work 5 hours a day without production decreasing." So again, he's really focused in on economy in the highest level, sort of bird's eye view sense. Like, how are we
Right.
allocating resources for people? How are we allocating and distributing the workload of things? Why are we giving, as again, he's sort of how he kicked off chapter 8 there, like, why are we giving certain capitalists entirely, like they can do whatever they want with
Right.
their day when all
Right.
these other people are spending 14, 15 hours a day slaving away? He's saying, well, that's just both unfair, but it's not, or it is unfair, but not just that. It's also just irrational, because it's like, well, that's literally just wasted
Right.
resources. You could have that person producing something, whether it's an intellectual task or whether it's a material task of production. He seems to think that, it's just kind of a waste of resources to do something like that, to allow these people to sort of just, kind of hang off of other people's value that they're producing there. I love how he's kind of taking it at a twin angle. He's taking it on the fairness angle, but then also just kind of the irrationality of it. And also, you were talking earlier about kind of feeling exhausted after work and how reducing the number of hours is important. One of the things that I was thinking about while reading this is how it's not just always about the amount of time that you work. I'm sure you've had this before where, you work the exact same amount one day as you did the day before, but this day was particularly
Hmm.
difficult. It turns out that, like, also the tasks that you're engaged in are very, very draining. You can go to work and sometimes have maybe a short work day, but it's still, really kick your ass. And so it could be the case that even shortening the workday wouldn't necessarily give you the kind of freedom or leisure that you might want in order to go pursue the sciences and pursue the art. Now, Kropotkin does have a good, interesting response to this. Again, going back to the idea of the integration of functions that we were sort of speaking about when we started talking about this chapter here. He seems to think that by integrating the tasks, so you have the artist, you have the intellectual tasks working together with the sort of mechanical and the print shop tasks, that by doing that and making sure that you distribute those tasks as well, that you would sort of bypass some of those concerns as well, that work would be less exhausting if you kind of mixed it in there. um,
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting idea. I don't know. I would need to see something like that in practice, because it does seem like the division of labor is pretty efficient. And I think that he is relying pretty heavily, like I was speaking there, on analogies with evolution to make his argument for how society should move forward. So I think I don't know. I think we could maybe ask questions there.
Yeah,
What do you
and it
think?
would be it would be interesting to see sort of modern calculations, like you were talking about, like a modern version of these calculations for how much work would people have to do to keep our society moving forward? And when you start to think about it, you start to realize there probably is a lot of room to improve people's lives. You got three people owning as much as the bottom half. I mean, it certainly seems like we could even things out a bit. And that's without even really changing anything. That would just be if you're changing what people have. But, I don't know what kind of jobs you've worked when you were younger, but I worked some pretty trash jobs when I was a kid. And a lot of those jobs have so many inefficiencies in them because it's a rule that someone came up with, right? You're going to, we have this rule at the workplace, and it's almost like you want to work around that rule because it's going to make everything better. If you didn't have quite this high hierarchy that you have here, I think a lot of those ridiculous things would be eliminated. You wouldn't have all this kind of waste.
Yeah.
You'd have a system that would work better for even the system we use now, where many jobs you don't get full benefits and full pay unless you work a certain number of hours per week, right? And we've seen there are actually places, major companies that use this to their advantage, where they generally keep everyone's hours limited, where they're keeping everyone part-time so that they don't have to give them benefits and pay them as much. And it's really just a system to keep those workers squashed. Whereas if we move to a different type of system where it wasn't a crime to only work 20 hours a week and you still earned your subsistence, we wouldn't have people struggling to work 2 or 3 of these 20-hour a week jobs in order to make ends meet. And it seems to me like with our modes of production, we would be able to meet those needs that people have.
Yeah, and specifically, so I worked at the Gap. I hated it to death. Even though, even when I wouldn't work a ton of hours in a week, I always felt like, even just working 3 hours in one day would just completely kick me, and I'd be down for 5 hours after work because I hated it so much. So it's definitely one of those jobs, and for sure, if I had more control over the production and sort of we were able to kind of work together on tasks, it does seem like it would be maybe a little bit less exhausting.
Right.
But I didn't have to, I definitely see that. I definitely see that. Now, the interesting thing, though, is how service sector work can relate to his idea of production, right? So he's very, very focused on mechanical production and the production of clear, specific resources, the kinds of things that, the economy was producing at the time. Well, now the majority of the economy, at least in the United States, is service sector, some kind of service sector. How do you shorten the workload for someone, for instance, who's at a call center, right? How do you balance that out? It would seem, you could, right? You could just say that, you have to work shorter hours, but that would mean that you'd have to hire more people into the call center, right? It would seem, right? And so I do think that there's kind of an interesting dynamic there, especially if you had more people with more leisure time, there might end up being more calls into a call center, for example. I suppose the solution is to automate, but anyway, I'm using the call center as a sort of example there, but there's a lot of service sector work where it just seems like some of the just shorten hours because, we might not quite work as well, because then you just need to hire more people in who are working at Old Navy and working at these clothing, or whatever it is, whatever it is, a kind of service sector job, in order to make sure that there's enough people to cover all the shifts, if people are working shorter hours. And so I suppose I'm a little curious how that would work. I imagine that there's workarounds, but it does seem like I was saying there, part 2 of chapter 8 is maybe a little bit dated.
Yeah, I think there definitely would have to be some modern calculations made, which probably someone has done. We just haven't run across it. But yeah, that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah. Well, but again, I'm just worried, you'd have a ton of people who are employed part-time at some service sector job. And oftentimes, if you're employed part-time, especially if they don't give you schedule hours, right? I love how, whenever you're applying for those kinds of jobs, they'll tell you they have flexible hours and they'll use that as a benefit. But really what that means is that you're on call all the time. And then they'll tell you 2 days ahead, oh, by the way, we need you in, at this particular day. But anyway, I would be worried that would be the kind of thing which a lot of people would have. And that's the kind of thing which is, I think, really, really stressful. Having an unscheduled workday is really stressful, because it feels like, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, I don't know how many of those kinds of jobs you've worked where like, one Wednesday you're working these
Hmm.
hours and then the next Wednesday like that can be much more stressful because like, yes, maybe you're making enough money, maybe you're getting your hours in, but it's hard to sort of schedule your day. You don't have that routine and it's maybe a little bit less enjoyable. It's more stressful. And that could be the kind of thing that would be really difficult to work around if we were to try to turn America into this kind of society. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, and I think the idea is maybe you wouldn't have this hierarchy as much. I mean, people would have a little more autonomy to work, I guess, when it works for them, which obviously raises
Well,
some
sure.
concerns. And then there are some jobs, like you mentioned, that would be very hard um, like. And I guess he kind of addresses this in the next chapter. I think it's the next chapter where he talks about
Well,
entertainment. I think he talks about it in the terms of writing books. But you figure there are some ways people contribute. It's really hard to measure that they're having that contribution to society.
mhm.
Like entertainment is one of them, right? Which is kind of weird
Well,
because some people think of entertainment as not a real job, and yet we all consume entertainment in one form or another. So it is
yeah,
still a contribution in some way. And then I think, well, how would you measure that? And then the answer, you come back around to money. Oh, money is the way that you measure, at least now, the way you contribute. So it's hard to escape that.
right.
That there's some other
Well,
way of
the
doing
the
it.
interesting thing though is he, so he says that, for instance, like you're going to have a certain number of hours that people all work and that this is done collectively. Well, if you're trying to allocate who's working which shift, and right, so this is a society where you have ownership, and so you're working together to decide who works which shift. Well, night shifts are obviously going to be more difficult to fill.
Right.
If you all have to work the exact same amount. And so they'd probably come to an agreement like, okay, instead of working, you only have to work 4 hours if you're doing a night shift as opposed to 5 hours. But then I think you'd sort of start to run into problems there as well,
Yeah.
right? Where some people are. So anyway, it's just it's an interesting thing that I think we'd have to kind of rethink a little bit in terms of adapting it to contemporary American society. I don't think that that's damning
Right.
for it. I think that it's still workable, but it couldn't go exactly as Kropotkin is saying
Right.
it if we were to try to do it today, which makes sense. It's 130 years
I
later.
think there would be unforeseen changes that we wouldn't expect now. I mean, like, and a lot of it, I think it would maybe make us wiser about our uses of resources, right? Like, there used to be a lot of people would exchange books. When you're done with a book and you're done reading it, you give it to someone else and they get to read it. And it seems
Mm,
like now we become so much of this, well, I want to read a book, I'm just going to buy it on Amazon, it'll show up at my house. But I think you might see a return to people being a little bit more careful with resources so that you don't have to go have someone produce those resources, since we're all being careful. So it might be that we move to a situation where there's just less trash being produced. I mean, so much stuff is just kind of garbage that people buy and we dispose of. We might be a little bit more careful about, are there certain things that don't need to be produced in the first place? And then are there some things that we can make last longer so that a book might be read by 10 different people before it ends up in a trash can or a landfill somewhere, which would eliminate the jobs of creating that junk. But then that would free up the jobs like you're talking about, I think, at the call center, where you do have, I work first half of the day at the call center, you work the second half, and you're not off making some, neither one of us is off work making some junk at a job. We're now producing the stuff that is maybe more necessary, but we're doing it less hours a week. Maybe.
yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a general approach to like how you'd probably have to think about one of these kind of an anarchist society. So you want to move on to the next chapter, chapter 9 on luxury?
Yeah, I'm glad he
Yeah.
approached, or he tackled this as a chapter, because it was, it's kind of a concern. We see these movies where everyone's wearing just a gray uniform and everyone looks the same, and everything's the same for everyone. So it's
Hmm.
nice that he took this approach to enlighten us that, yeah, you can have the thing. The idea isn't just to work as little as possible and then we're all just sort of sitting around staring at the walls. The idea is that this is freeing up time for us to nurture our intellectual side, our creativity side, our artistic side. He really kind of pushes that in order to be a full human, you have to have this other side, and almost you start to realize, oh yeah, this working that we do, where we work ourselves to death, is really to the detriment of this other side of being a human, which is to be creative and to have hobbies and do fun things with people and have that luxury, which, shouldn't really just be reserved for the people at the top of that
For
pyramid.
a
It
few,
should
right.
really be, you were born a human being. Okay, do some work, pitch in, and then you get to have some luxury too.
Yeah, I really appreciate him again just mentioning it as like a full chapter and really working it through because I think, one of the concerns that I've had is that so far with this book, and I think that he does do a lot to kind of address that concern, is I'm not convinced that there's a sharp distinction between luxuries and necessities. It seems like in many respects, some luxuries are a necessity in the sense that like you need to have some things that make you feel special, that make you feel like an individual, and that without that, you can't fully come to your own capacities. And Kropotkin seems to, throughout this book, really focus in on the importance of necessities and making sure that everybody has their needs provided. And obviously, that's super important because we do have enough resources to provide for everybody's needs. But then there's also a real question there of, well, then how are you making sure to provide for everybody's luxuries or that the luxuries that some people want? And he seems to think, well, you'd have different kind of communes that are interested with different pursuits. So you would have a group that's very interested in, for instance, astronomy and looking at the stars. Some groups that are interested in looking at literature and things like that. And you could even integrate the production and the work with those kinds of free time hours. So, if you're building a telescope or, you're interested in, for instance, astronomy, you'd also be involved in building that telescope or
Right.
building, the example that he really focuses in on is printing and how it's so difficult to print. And at the time of writing, although he does have an asterisk there, I think saying that like for instance, like a later version of the book that newer technologies had since been invented from the first printing of the book and the second printing of this book. But at least in my copy. But for instance, talking about how they were still using movable metal type, that printing has hardly advanced, and that it's really difficult, and that people can, get injured moving, printing type and things like that, and focusing in on, well, what would happen if the artist or the person was not only involved in creating the art, but then also involved in the printing of it. And I think that what he kind of hones in on there, because some people would argue, he responds to this argument by saying that, well, that would mean that the work is less good, that the art is less good. But he's saying, no, actually, it would be better
Mm-hmm.
because it would be more in touch with other people. And
Right.
so your work would be more appealing to a larger audience. So, for instance, how are you going to capture the beauty of a sunset when you never worked on a farm looking like, if you're gonna be making a painting of a sunset over a farm, wouldn't it be even more beautiful if you could capture the sentiment of having a hard day's work and walking home looking at the sunset? Wouldn't that make your art even prettier?
Right.
And that's kind of the idea that he kind of hones in on there. And I think that that was quite good. I think that was quite good.
Yeah, and he mentions writing quite a bit in here, which is, right now, I mean, if you're going to try to be a writer, I mean, you have to be doing fairly well in society, right? If you're going to devote a huge amount of time to writing. And his approach in here kind of says, well, you'll actually be better off if you are part of the day contributing to some job, because then you know what it's like. This will give you the things to write about and to know what it's really like to be a worker and to be in these different situations. He kind of compares it to a migratory bird flying over a land that doesn't really know that land. You're just sort of seeing it from a distance. How does that bird really know what's going on at the land versus the situation where you're in it for the first part of the day, you go work your job, and then you come home and you're not exhausted. You can do your writing, and yet you're still sort of grounded into your community. That makes you, keeps you for the things that you're writing about, keeps you grounded in there.
Yeah, I thought that that was actually quite clever. I really did. That, kind of the integration of functions, again, kind of the same idea that we are carrying over from the last chapter and from our last video talking about it. He seems to think that this would actually make art a whole lot better because, I mean, this is actually a long-standing argument. People would use this as an argument for the monarchy and all kinds of different things, that actually we really do need to have people out there who just don't do anything except for philosophize, don't do anything except for stare up at the stars. Because after all, the unexamined life, as Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Without philosophy, and I actually kind of agree, like without philosophy, there'd be no point to living. But and he's actually pointing out here how actually you don't need to have a certain class of people who don't do any other work besides philosophy. In fact, your philosophy would be better
Right.
if you were involved in the printing of it. You're involved in the collaborative efforts of things and scientific work coming together to you know for instance, like geological theorists is an example he used. How geological theorists should also be involved in the surveying and the mapping and all these other parts of things that this would make for better science as well.
Right.
And I think that I think there's a case to be made there. He's not making a dull case. I think there's a real case there.
Yeah. And then there's a quote in here. We kind of had mentioned this before we started the show today. So he talks about, no doubt nowadays when hundreds and thousands of human beings are in need of bread, coal, clothing, and shelter, luxury is a crime. To satisfy it, the worker's child must go without bread. So he's really kind of showing, I think, what sometimes we don't even realize that we think this, or some of us may think this in society, where, sometimes if I have some time where I'm relaxing and I'm not being productive, I almost start to feel like a guilt over it, right? Or, you have like this a little bit of anxiety because you're not out there producing, you're not out there working. And that, I think, is related to this idea of luxury being a crime. If my family doesn't have enough, but I want to claim that little bit of luxury that we're saying, every human kind of needs, well, that luxury is a crime against my family, because then there's not enough food for a child or a spouse, or, somebody's not getting quite what they need, versus a system where everyone's needs are met. That luxury is not a crime anymore. It's actually a benefit to us that you can become a fully realized person because you have that time. You're not just a a meat machine that's creating money for Jeff Bezos or whoever. You're able to devote time to your own self and become sort of self-actualized, like we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean it's a really good point to make here because look, he does, and I think that this is why it's so important to mention, because earlier in the book he is criticizing luxury actively. Making fun of people for having all this luxurious time, making fun of people for having these, elaborate dresses and elaborate gowns and things like that. So he does say here that when people are in need of bread, coal, and clothing, again, linking in clothing with absolute needs and shelter, then luxury is a crime. But then he goes on to say that, well, once everybody's needs is met, then luxury is an absolute necessity. Then these things are completely necessary in order for people to make it by, in order for people to get there. And also, and this is, I think, super, super important here, he points out here, I can't, yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly where this part is, but he basically points out here how, if you can't just focus on the luxuries later, right? Like they'll oftentimes say, he talks about here, for instance, the founders of new societies established in American deserts never understood that they in fact needed to have luxuries there. They said, well, we'll do luxuries in the future. First, we'll focus on necessities, then we'll talk about luxuries after everybody has their needs met. But instead, and turns out he goes on to argue that actually this was why those systems just failed, why those attempts at communism in America just completely failed, because they just waited on luxury, but you need them kind of from the beginning. You need a way for people to express their individuality, for people to express themselves, for them to express their love of science, their love of art, their love of philosophy, mathematics, what have you. Like, you need to have that in order for people to stay committed to a common cause. Otherwise, it just won't work.
Right. Yeah, and I think it sort of changes the way that we look at science and these things that we're approaching, where it's difficult, like in our modern society, like especially science is so hard because science generally takes resources to do, which means you need someone else's permission in order to do science. You need someone else to grant you some amount of money or some type of laboratory or something that you can go through in order to now do your science. But he talks about here a situation where people can sort of work together. You have a group of people who want to do science. They can sort of make that happen because you don't have to wait for some really, really rich person to grant you okay, I will give you some funds so that you can do science. And, and so it's, in a lot of ways, we're sort of stifling science, I think, in this country right now because people aren't, a lot of times people aren't willing to pay for science. There's always this question in science, well, what are we going to do with it? What is the end goal of this? It's like, which I think is so counter to how much of science is actually done. A lot of science is done for the sake of science, for the sake of learning. I mean, the
Yeah.
work that I did in mathematics in graduate school, the original work that we did, we weren't working on it knowing what the end goal was. You're creating this new mathematics, and then 10 years later some grad student's going to take my work and turn it into some actual thing that someone's producing. But that wasn't our goal at the time, was to
Maybe, but
was to
even if it never did,
right.
even if it never did though, there's still some value
Exactly.
in just the project for its own sake and thinking for its and thinking in its own sake. Isn't there this famous work by Hardy, I can't remember his first name, the pure mathematics professor at Cambridge, around the time when he was writing, talking about specifically this point that pure mathematics should be pursued for its own sake, and that anyway,
Right.
but that he has some interesting stuff on that. Uh, but yeah, no, it's absolutely right that these things need to be pursued for their own sake and not just for the ends of what it's going to produce. I mean,
Right.
it's very unlikely, for instance, that the discovery of the Higgs boson is going to lead to any kind of true technological
Right.
advancement because the Higgs can only really exist, at least in kind of an observable state, for very short amount of time. I mean, it kind of does exist, but it's complicated,
Right.
right? I'm not sure that I really understand it, but it's probably not going to lead to any kind of direct technological innovation or something like that. Now, one of the interesting things, though, talking about sort of scientific advancement, he seems to think that if you opened it up so that everybody would have access to these scientific literatures and scientific resources, and everybody was kind of collaborating on these projects, you wouldn't have the kind of rejection of certain scientific papers that you did in his day. So he goes, for instance, actually, you want to just read this section about science? This is the start of part 4. Um, he goes on here to say at the start of part 4, second paragraph, he says, "What means has the scientist today to make researches that interest him? Should he, today, of course, we would add she, should he ask help of the state, which can only be given to one candidate in 100, and which only he may obtain who promises ostensibly to keep to the beaten track? Let us remember how the Academy of Sciences in France repudiated Darwin, or how the Academy of St. Petersburg treated Mendeleev with contempt, and how the Royal Society of London refused to publish Joule's paper in which he determined the mechanical equivalent of heat, finding it unscientific." I'll be honest, I'm not sure that I'm convinced entirely that people would stop viewing certain things as unscientific if we started in a collaborative enterprise. I mean, he seems to think that it was entirely because you had kind of top-down top-down views rejecting publication for certain works. And certainly, like, that's the case. I mean, one of the interesting cases throughout the history of physics is Einstein's paper on special relativity probably wouldn't have been published had it not been for the fact that he had friends kind of working with that particular publication.
Mm.
And work right now going on with Wolfram, Stephen Wolfram in physics. He's working on a fundamental theory of physics. He's not directly publishing it in kind of the typical peer review thing, although I will say some of the criticisms of it are kind of interesting because they're saying, well, he's not seeking peer review. He's also literally publishing publicly all of his stuff. So if anyone wants to go in and peer review it, they can. So I think some of those criticisms are maybe a little bit disingenuous. But anyway, specifically referring to Joule's work on the mechanical equivalence of heat and finding it unscientific, that's kind of related. Well, not specifically Joule's, but some of the interesting work on heat and mechanical interpretations of heat were related to the invention of, or the discovery, we should say, of the atom. And one of the things is that atomic thought and whether or not molecules and atoms really existed, it really was thought of as unscientific at the time. And the reason for that was actually, I mean, right. So the mechanical interpretation of heat is partially, I mean, not specifically in Joule's case, but later versions of mechanical interpretation of heat was, the idea that atoms come together and then, like, the faster they move, the hotter things get, right? That was like a kind of later adaptation of some of this stuff. Again, not specifically Joule's, but in the case of atoms, which I know a little bit more better than Joule's case, part of the reason why it was thought of as unscientific was because it was only thought of as a mathematical approximation. And at the time, the sort of dominant theory of mathematics was that mathematics was entirely derived from empirical experience. So in the case of Ernst Mach, a famous empiricist, philosopher, and physicist who, for instance, like going 1 Mach, 2 Mach, and like sound, he did a lot of work with sound waves and with optics. He was also a physician. He rejected the idea of atoms in part because of his conception of mathematics, because he thought, well, it may be a useful mathematical trick in order to describe the world, but that doesn't mean that it's really the case, because again, mathematics he was thinking of as being entirely derived from experience. And so how are you going to use mathematics in order to derive something which you can't finally experience? That's a very simplified version of the argument. But he's saying, well, yes, mathematically you can simplify your work by using atoms, but we have no reason that we can trust mathematics when we start going beyond our experience. And it required a lot of philosophical work to move mathematics beyond that, and also work in logic and things like that. And so anyway, my point being, what makes something unscientific is very complicated. It's not just review articles rejecting certain things. It's also like prevailing philosophical attitudes, and honestly, like all the way to the end, people were rejecting the idea of atoms. It wasn't until Einstein's really work on Brownian motion to develop a mathematical technique to determine the size of atoms that they were like, okay, well, we finally have empirical proof that atoms are definitely there and we can know about their size and things like that. And so it's really tricky. I don't know. I just read that and I know a little bit about the atomics thing and different things being found unscientific. I'm very, very interested in what makes something scientific. And I did not find that particular paragraph all that convincing. It's a lot more than just, people rejecting things because they have some authority. It's also just the case that these are very deeply tied up. And there's a lot of people right now who think that part of the reason why we're not making progress in quantum mechanics is because our conception of mathematics is a little bit dated. And so there's been people working in intuitionist mathematics trying to develop a new theory of mathematics, which can account for quantum mechanics and rules with like the law of excluded middle and logic. And it's very, very complicated, but it's not straightforward. Like there's just a review article and they're blanking it. But anyway, I'm tangenting off.
No,
of
yeah, but it's an interesting thought because science and math have clearly changed a lot since Kropotkin's time, and yet there are some very legitimate complaints about how science is done in this country with peer review, and then what topics people choose to study because it is a career move, because they're trying to get tenure or they're trying to get a job at a certain company, and then the funding of science and mathematics.
Right. I mean, and all of that's very real.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely like some of that is definitely very real, but there's also just like prevailing reasons and very strong reasons why you should think that something is unscientific, that goes beyond just some hierarchy that's going to stamp down some new bold idea.
Right.
It's pretty complicated.
And some are,
I don't know.
think some are just inherent. I think some of these problems are inherently tied to capitalism in some type of way, and not necessarily that someone wouldn't want something, but just because so many people don't see the point of it if it's not bringing in money, if it's not bringing in a profit. But yeah, and it's interesting. And then how it kind of ties in with, I guess transitioning a little bit, but kind of related to the invention with how it ties into patents. And he brings up this idea of how patents are actually sort of stifling the system, right? So patents have been tried, and we know with what results. The inventor sells his patent for a few pounds, and the man who has only lent the capital pockets the enormous profits often resulting from the invention. So another kind of issue with the fact that, why do we have this kind of system which doesn't even pay off for the person who did the inventing, right? And it's clear what he thinks. I mean, he talks throughout the book about how those should go to benefit everyone, right? Especially in the later generations. You kind of owe the society that you have to the people that came before you. So it is kind of a weird thing that someone would be able to sweep that up with this patent and then kind of own that labor and then get to decide, what should be invented and what shouldn't be invented and so on.
Yeah, and also he uses an example, I think it was from St. Petersburg. I guess they had this mechanic shop that anybody could go
Mm,
into, any worker could go into and use the tools for free. They might have to pay for wood or metal,
right,
but they could use the tools for free. And how people are like hiding their inventions from one another. They're not really
right.
sharing their inventions and collaborating together because of the possibility of a patent. And so he's arguing that this really stifles the possibility of invention because you have to work together on a common project in order to really be able to, pursue something great and something grand. And so if you're just kind of stifling that out to individual people and it becomes a competitive market space, then that's a lot of wasted opportunity to try to invent something which could be used in common.
And the speed as well. I mean, this ability to how much faster can you create if you are doing it in the open with the help of a group of people rather than trying to keep things secret
Now,
so that you can be the one who develops it first and get it out to market and make the money rather than just, this is something the world needs. Let's kind of produce it. And that's going on right now in our world with the production of vaccines and some countries and some companies being very secretive and say we need to protect our patent and we need to get this out so we can make the money, whereas some other countries and companies are saying it's probably about saving people's lives and getting things out sooner.
Now, I will say I agree that it could help maybe like changing patent laws and really reducing things, but there's also like a fame aspect to a lot of inventions that a lot of people are, very jealous of. I mean, the famous example, of course, is Isaac Newton and Leibniz with the invention of calculus, right? For the rest of Newton's life, he was convinced that Leibniz had stolen stuff
Mm-hmm.
from, stolen stuff about calculus. It seems, I mean, you probably know more about this than I would, but it seems like most people now agree that it was invented
Yeah.
separately between Newton and Leibniz, and suggesting, of course, that the ideas were already all in the air
Mm-hmm.
at the time. But in any case, it does seem as though like there also is this sense in Rutherford, for instance. I think it's Rutherford with like his work on like radio waves and things like that. How initially he wanted to go into business and make like a lot of money, but then he ended up deciding to pursue it scientifically. And I can't remember who it was, but some other person made like a ton of money off of radio and commercializing it and stuff like that. Now he never regretted it, and he always thought that this was like the right thing to make. But he also got the credit. Rutherford also got the fame, got the credit, got the recognition, didn't get the money. He took the trade and said that it was always worth it, never regretted it, being able to pursue things and, make all kinds of other discovery about radiation. But there is a question there. I don't know that it would get rid of all of it in quite the way that he seems to think, because there's still like this idea of people like wanting to invent something and being given the recognition for it. Whereas, you look right now where hundreds of people were involved with the discovery of the top quark. And like, do I know the names of them? No, I don't know the names. But if one person had been involved with it, yeah, I might know the name of the person who discovered the top quark or the person who discovered the Higgs boson. But no, it turns out hundreds and hundreds of people were involved in this effort. And so, no, I don't know the names.
Right.
you know. So I don't know, but again, people are still pursuing it actively and happily
Right.
pursuing it. So I don't know. But I don't know. It's kind of what I thought about while reading
And
it.
it may be that motivation wouldn't exist. I mean, I think there's lots of reasons why people strive to be famous, but I think one of it is to escape this being on the bottom, right? Because we know being on the
Mm.
bottom of society is not a great place to be. And one way to
Well,
escape that
capitalism.
is to be famous, right?
Well, right, and I think that it is interesting that people will trade that for money, and it does show you, I think, how capitalism is not just an economic system, but also a social system which allocates social standing, right? Like our money oftentimes is tied in with social standing and all kinds of crazy things, like people being more likely to hold open doors for people who are wearing suits and
Mhm.
and all kinds of things like that. Um, and I think it does show how economic systems are also tied in with those social systems, that people would be willing to make those kinds of trades. That I don't know. I just think that that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
it is
but anyway,
interesting.
so anything else that you were going to add for the chapter 9 on luxury, or?
Just yeah, I mean, there's a couple of interesting little quotes. I think the way he closes out the chapter, that literally that final sentence of the chapter is pretty good. In working to put an end to the division between master and slave, we work for the happiness of both, for the happiness of humanity. I think that's pretty good because it's, he's kind of saying we'll move past this idea. And it's not even like a retribution to get back at the people who were masters before. It's like, let's just move to a healthier place for everyone. He seems like he does a pretty good job at staying in a healthy place when he's thinking about this, whereas me, I start to get a little grumpy. I complain about Bezos and the other billionaires and stuff like this, but he seems to really just, let's get to a place where we break this division between master and slave and we can bring happiness to everyone, which I think is a nice thought.
Yeah, hopefully we can get there, get to a happier world where we can quote, in the working to put an end to the division of labor between master and slave, we work from the happiness of both, like you were saying. Yeah, I think that would be really good. That'd be really good. Yeah, being able to I will say, yeah, keeping the happiness of the master in mind.
Right.
Wow, that's tough to do, but he's saying in some sense that that's needed, right? That if we don't do that, then we won't ever really achieve a revolution. That's hard. I think that's really hard. Not just turning everything into kind of guillotine revolution.
Right. It takes some thought and some
very
planning
difficult
to be able to think about it that way.
Yeah, it requires a lot of organization. You wonder how a revolution like that could come about. It'd be, I think, really difficult.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so next time around, what chapters are we looking at? You want to do chapters? Is it, how long is 10, 11, and 12, or do you want to just do 2?
Long.
Okay, yeah, so definitely. So next time around, we'll be looking at chapters 10 and 11 of the Conquest of Bread. Guys, thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you all next time around. We'll be live again next week, Wednesday, 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. So see you all